Hello, friends. This is Dr. Beal back again. I want to get my camera fixed just right. But I want you to know that this is the lesson for, for May 2023 on Thursday, and it's taken from John chapter 11. What I want you to do with this video and the two that follow it is for each of them, as we've done in the past, I want you to give me one preaching point from each video, and then I want you to give me, 3 sentences maybe, backing up that preaching point and telling me what you would say about that preaching point. And so we'll have chapter 11 probably divided up into 3 videos, and hopefully that goes well this morning. In John chapter 10, if you'll remember, Jesus had gone to Jerusalem for the Feast of the Tabernacles, and he had gone from Galilee down to Jerusalem. That's the last time he'll ever be in Galilee during his lifetime. He will go back after the resurrection, but before his crucifixion, that would be his last time in Galilee. And he travels down to Jerusalem for the Feast of the Tabernacles. And there are a lot of things that we studied about that happened during the Feast of the Tabernacles, and even things that happened in Jerusalem after the Feast of the Tabernacles. But then at the end of chapter 10, we get this story that happens at the Feast of Dedication, which is in December of the last year of Jesus' life. And so he's going to be crucified in the spring during Passover. But what happens at the end of chapter 10 happens in the month of December. And at the end of chapter 10, verses 40, 41, and 42, it says this, and I just want to read this again to get us to where we need to be entering into John chapter 11. But John 10, verse 40 and following, Jesus went back across the Jordan to the place where John had been baptizing in the early days. Here he stayed, and many people came to him. They said, though John never performed a miraculous sign, all that John said about this man was true, and in that place many people believed in Jesus. And so Jesus went back across the Jordan River. He went out of Israel proper, back to the east side of the Jordan River, and there he taught, and there many people came to believe in him. Now, chapter 11 picks up, and Jesus is right there on the other side of the Jordan River. And in chapter 11, verse 1, it says, now a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, Lord, the one you love is sick. So you have this man, Lazarus, introduced to us. And of course, Lazarus and Mary and Martha are no strangers. We know them from the text. We know that Jesus often stayed at their house. We have other stories of things that happened at their house with Mary and Martha. And it also says that Mary was the one who would pour perfume on Jesus and wipe his feet with her hair. And that story happens later on in the Gospel of John. And so John is just telling us here, what's going to happen. So he was sick, and his sister sent word to Jesus that the one you love is sick. In other words, Lazarus, our brother, is sick. Well, verse 4 says, when Jesus heard this, Jesus said, the sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. Yet when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. So Jesus, when he hears about it, when word finally gets to him that Lazarus is sick, he says that the sickness will not end in death. Now we know that death's going to be a part of it because we know the story. We know that Lazarus is going to die, but we also know that it will not end in death. And he said that the reason of this sickness is so that God's Son, Jesus, may be glorified through Lazarus' sickness. I don't know, there may be a preaching point here because a lot of bad things happen. And it may very well be that one of the reasons they happen is so God's Son can be glorified through what we have to suffer. Lazarus is going to have to suffer death. Mary and Martha are going to have to suffer the loss of their brother. But in the end, God's going to be glorified through it. And so Jesus decided to stay where he was 2 days after he got the message. Then he said to his disciples, let us go back to Judea. But Rabbi, they said, a short while ago the Jews tried to stone you, and yet you're going to go back there? And that's true. This is late winter, early spring of the year in the northern hemisphere. And we know that in December, they picked up rocks. In chapter 10, verse 33, it says, we're not stoning you for any of these. We're stoning you for blasphemy. And so in verse 31, they said they had picked up stones to stone him. Now it is just a few months later, and Jesus is going to go back. And his disciples said, well, they were just trying to stone you. Why do you want to go back? And he answered in verse 9, are there not 12 hours of daylight? A man who walks by day will not stumble, for he sees by this world's light. It is when he walks by night that he stumbles, for he has no light. After he had said this, he went on to tell them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I'm going there to wake him up. His disciples replied, Lord, if he sleeps, he'll get better. Jesus had been speaking of his death, but his disciples thought he meant natural sleep. So Jesus wanted to go back to Judea. His disciples told him, hey, they're trying to kill you there. Why do you want to go back? And Jesus tells him about about light and darkness. Here we have it again in John's Gospel, light and darkness. He said there's 12 hours of daylight. And, in that part of the country, pretty much on average, you have 12 hours of daylight. And he said, a man who walks by day, he won't stumble. It's when he walks at night that he stumbles, for he has no light. Well, Jesus is speaking here of physical light and physical darkness, but of course he's meaning spiritual light and spiritual darkness. And he's saying Jesus walks in the light of God. He walks in spiritual light. And then he went on to say, we have to go back because our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I'm going to go there to wake him up. Well, what Jesus was saying is Lazarus has died. They just don't know that. The disciples think that he's just fallen asleep. He's lying there in bed and he's asleep. And so he said, the disciples said, if he's asleep, he'll get better. But in verse 14, Jesus just tells them plainly. Verse 14. So then he told them plainly, Lazarus is dead, and for your sake I'm glad that I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him. Then Thomas, called Didymus, said to the rest of the disciples, let us also go, that we may die with him. So they're thinking that Lazarus has just fallen asleep. And Jesus tells them plainly, no, he's dead. And you know what? I'm glad that we weren't there, because you need to believe. Jesus wanted them to see this miracle of Lazarus rising from the dead. And finally, Thomas called Didymus. I don't know if you're familiar with the word Didymus, but Didymus means the twin. And so Thomas was a twin. And we don't know who his twin was, whether a man or a woman, but Thomas was a twin. And, we know him later on as Doubting Thomas, and we'll read about that in the latter part of John's Gospel. But here he said, let's go that we may die with him. Now, there's two ways that we can look at this. Number one, Thomas certainly is being pessimistic, because he's saying Jesus is going to die. But he's also saying, let's go and die with him. I don't know if he's being sarcastic and saying, well, if he's going to go back and act like a fool and get killed, then we'll just go with him. Or if he's saying Jesus is going back and he's going to be facing danger, so we need to go with him. One of the two. And so I want you to take this section, the first 16 verses, give me a preaching point, and then give me about 3 sentences that tell me what you're going to say about that preaching point. And then I want you to send it to my inbox on WhatsApp. Thanks, and God bless.